At 0726 local time, the Russian patrol ship Rasul Gamzatov picked up 2 contacts on radar, small, slow, 12 kilometers out and closing from the west. Her crew went to battle stations. Her AK-630 cannon swung toward the threat. What she couldn't know was that a fatal design flaw had already sunk this ship. The 2 Ukrainian FP-2 drones had launched hours earlier from outside Dnipro, and their first threat came from their own side. A Ukrainian Buk M1 battery near Pavlograd acquired the drones at 0251. Low, slow contacts heading southeast, matching the Shahed profile the crew had been hunting all week. The fire control officer's hand hovered over the launch authorization. 10 seconds to weapons release. 5. Then he checked the no engage list. Corridor 7, active 2230 to 0400. The drones were flying directly through the protected corridor at 200 meters, heading 142. His hand came off the firing authorization so fast, he nearly knocked his headset loose. They'd been 5 seconds from destroying a Ukrainian special operation with a Ukrainian missile. The drones passed through at 0253 without ever knowing how close they'd come. Ahead lay 300 kilometers of Russian airspace, and everyone there actually was trying to shoot them down. The FP-2s crossed into occupied territory at 0312, dropping to 60 meters as the frozen Donbass scrolled beneath. At that altitude, Russian radar couldn't touch it, not because of stealth, but because of physics. Radar energy travels in straight lines. The Earth curves. Put an antenna on a truck 8 meters tall and point it at something flying 60 meters above the ground, and the math is unforgiving. Line of sight ends at roughly 35 kilometers. Beyond that distance, the target is below the horizon. The radar can pump out megawatts of energy and it won't matter. The signal will pass overhead, nothing touching what it's looking for. The planet itself becomes cover. The drone's route exploited every gap created by that geometry. S-400 batteries near Rostov had theoretical ranges of 400 kilometers, but that assumes targets at altitude where the radar could see them. Against something at 60 meters, their effective detection range collapsed to a few dozen kilometers, and the FP-2's course stayed outside even that, threading between overlapping coverage zones like a game of Mario Kart, avoiding bananas and turtle shells. 12 kilometers of safe corridor in some places, 8 in the tightest sections. Drift too far north and the battery at Milarovo would paint you. Drift south and the S-300 complex at Temensk would have a firing solution before you knew you'd been seen. The margins were thin, but the drone didn't need wide margins. It just needed the route to be right. The problem was that the airspace wasn't empty. At 0334, an Mi-8 helicopter lifted off from Kamensk-Shatinsky on a routine patrol. The crew wasn't hunting drones. They were watching for Ukrainian sabotage teams near the rail lines, part of the security screen that had tightened after partisans hit a logistics hub in November. But Russian air defense saw both aircraft on the same integrated display, and someone noticed that the smaller contact had been flying a straight line for 12 minutes. Birds don't do that. Someone vectored the helicopter south to get a visual. The drones couldn't change course even if it knew the helicopter was coming. No data link, no warning receiver, no ability to deviate from waypoints programmed months earlier. But that wasn't how the squeeze worked. The helicopter wasn't pushing the drone, it was pushing Russian attention. The search pattern told every radar operator in the sector to focus on that corridor, to look harder at faint returns they might otherwise ignore. The safe route hadn't moved. Russian eyes had just been pointed directly at it. 10 kilometers from the Milarovo coverage zone, then 9. The drone held its program course, mechanical and oblivious, while the geometry squeezed tighter. 8 kilometers. The radar horizon that had been protecting the FP-2s were about to become a problem instead of a solution. At this range, atmospheric effects started to matter. Temperature inversions could bend radar energy over the horizon, extending detection range by kilometers. Cold air over warmer ground created layers that acted like lenses, ducting signals into places they shouldn't reach. At 0341, the helicopter arrived at the search coordinates and found nothing. The drone had passed through 4 minutes earlier, but the squeeze had put them within 8.7 kilometers of the Milarovo radar, inside the margin where a lucky bounce could paint a return. The S-300's acquisition radar swept the sector at 0343. It found something, faint, intermittent, flickering at the edge of detection like a ghost. The operator watched it appear, disappear, shift position. Textbook atmospheric clutter. Except atmospheric clutter didn't usually hold a consistent heading. Probably nothing. Probably a temperature layer playing tricks. One phone call to Kremsk would scramble fighters and wake up half the air defense network. Was a flickering ghost worth that? He logged the contact as low confidence and went back to the primary sectors. One decision, one phone call that didn't happen. The drone flew on toward 300 kilometers of empty steppe. Empty except for the hunters already circling above it. The Kalmyk steppe was 300 kilometers of frozen nothing between the Volga and the Caspian. No cities, no infrastructure, nothing worth protecting. It's basically Russia's version of Kansas. After the strikes on Russian near areas in November, Air Defense Command had learned an uncomfortable lesson. You can't park an S-400 in the middle of nowhere. The battery needs roads, power, supply lines, personnel who need food and shelter and rotation. The steppe had none of that. So they put fighters in the air instead. 12,000 meters above the grassland, two Su-30s from Kremsk flew a racetrack pattern, 80 kilometers northwest, sweeping turn, 80 southeast, turn again. 3 hours airborne, burning 3,000 liters per hour to watch empty sky. Expensive, tedious, and, after drones started reaching targets that weren't supposed to be reachable, absolutely necessary. Their Urbis E radar you see here could detect a fighter at 350 kilometers. Against something the size of the FP2, that range collapsed dramatically. Radar cross-section scales with the square of the target's dimensions. Half the size, quarter the detection range. The drone's signature was roughly equivalent to a large seagull, maybe 1/10 of a square meter. At 50 meters altitude with ground clutter filling the scope, practical detection range dropped to single digits. The drone might as well have been invisible. But the radar wasn't the only way to hunt. The OLS-30 infrared sensor you see mounted in the Su-30's nose was passive. It didn't emit anything, just watched for heat that shouldn't exist. Here's why that mattered. Radar needs reflected energy. It sends out a pulse and listens for the bounce. A tiny target against a cluttered background returns almost nothing usable. The signal scatters, gets lost in the noise, disappears. Infrared doesn't work that way. It's not looking for reflections, it's looking for heat. The FP2's exhaust didn't need to bounce anything back, it just needed to be hotter than what was behind it. The FP2's engine was pushing exhaust at 600 degrees Celsius into air measuring -15. 615 degrees of temperature differential. Against frozen steppe, that thermal contrast was impossible to hide. It was about as obvious as the advertising on a dollar slice store in New York City. The infrared return didn't care about radar cross-section or ground clutter. Heat was heat. The only question was whether the sensor was pointed in the right direction. Right now, it wasn't. The OLS-30 looked forward and down, scanning 90 degrees left and right, 60 up and 60 down. It saw what was ahead of the aircraft, not what was behind. The FP2 sat 40 kilometers behind the fighters and 12,000 meters below, squarely in the blind spot that exists behind any forward-looking system. Not invisible, just in the wrong place to be seen. The seeker was watching the ceiling, the target was on the floor. But the racetrack would bring them around. 18 minutes until the fighters reversed course. When they did, their sensors would sweep directly across the corridor the drone was transiting. The math was simple. Clear the zone before they turn, or light up their displays like the final night at a Burning Man festival. The FP2s continued cruising at 160 kilometers per hour, but the Russian jets were faster. At 0529, the fighters completed their northwest leg and banked into the turn. When they rolled out heading southeast, the geometry flipped. They were no longer flying away from the drone. They were closing at 800 kilometers per hour combined. Infrared sensors now scanning exactly where they had to go. 4 minutes to detection range, 3 to identification, 2 to visual. The R-73 missiles under their wings could engage anything they could see, and they were very good at seeing heat sources against cold backgrounds. The drones flew on with no idea the threat had reversed. Mechanical indifference, programmed waypoints, exhaust plumes streaming into frozen air while 2 of Russia's most capable fighters came hunting. At 0553, the lead pilot's radar flagged an anomaly. Bearing 320, range 28 kilometers. Weak return, barely above background noise, but moving with consistent bearing rate. Not a vehicle on a road, not atmospheric shimmer, something airborne, out where nothing should be flying. He bumped the throttle and adjusted course 15 degrees north. His wingman slid into a combat spread, 2 kilometers lateral separation, ready to bracket whatever they'd found. Time to identification, 3 minutes. But their route included a waypoint at 0532, a 15-degree turn to heading 095, almost due east. Ukrainian planners had built the route based on historical patrol patterns pulled from signals intelligence. They couldn't predict exactly where fighters would be on any given day, but they knew the general idea. The waypoint was insurance against exactly this scenario. As the Su-30s accelerated toward the thermal contact, the drone executed its program turn. The new heading took it perpendicular to their approach, sliding across their sensor field instead of toward them. The exhaust plume had been a bright point source rotated to an edge on silver. Thermal signature dropped. Ground clutter contaminated the return. At 0535, range 21 kilometers, the contact dissolved into noise. The lead pilot adjusted filters, increased sensitivity, ran the track back. Nothing. Whatever had been there was gone. If anything had been there at all. Sensor ghosts happened. Cold air did strange things. You couldn't chase every flicker across the steppe. The formation held heading for another 60 seconds, sensors straining, then broke off. Fuel state was becoming a problem. 18 minutes to either turn for Kremisk or flame out over the grassland. And flaming out wasn't an option anyone wanted to explain to Squadron Command. The FP2s cleared the patrol zone at 0554, still at 50 meters, still on its program route, completely unaware it had passed within 21 kilometers of fighters actively hunting for exactly what it was. 15 degrees of course change, 90 seconds of timing. That had been the margin between mission success and eating a missile. 189 kilometers to the target. The Caspian was ahead. Now they had to remain hidden when every sensor was now looking straight up at them. At 0726 hours, the FP2s descended to 40 meters above the Caspian and activated its thermal seeker. 15 kilometers ahead, the Rasul Gamzatov sat in her night steam box with every system running. Radar sweeping. The SP-520 tracking station manned. The AK-360 crew in their mount. The ship's radar painted the drone at 12 kilometers. Small return, moving slower, bearing 270, right off the port beam. The contact was solid. The problem wasn't detection. The problem was where the drone was coming from. The AK-630 sat on the bow, 6 barrels pointed forward. The system was designed to be automatic. MR-123 fire control radar tracked the target, fed data to the computer, and the computer commanded the gun mount. No human reaction time in the loop. The radar would see, the computer would calculate, and the 6 barrels would be waiting at the predicted intercept point before the target arrived. Against missiles and aircraft, it was devastatingly effective. But the system had limits. Arcs where the ship's own superstructure blocked the line of fire. Masts, exhaust stacks, the helicopter hangar aft. The weapon couldn't shoot through its own ship. From bearing 270, the drone was just outside the edge of that cutout, sliding along the boundary where the gun could almost track but not quite engage. And here's what that did to the fire control system. The radar saw the target perfectly. The computer generated a firing solution. The mount received the command to slew to bearing 270, but at 268 degrees of traverse, the gun hit its mechanical stop. The computer kept updating the solution. The gun kept trying to follow, and every few seconds, the system threw a fault. Loss of track, target outside engagement envelope, then reacquired and tried again. The very automation that made the AK-360 effective was now working against itself, chasing a solution it physically couldn't reach. 10 kilometers. The captain understood the geometry immediately and ordered the helm hard to port, swing the bow toward the contact, rotate the ship until the drone fell inside the weapon's arc. Basic naval gunnery. If you can't bring the gun to the target, bring the ship to the gun. The Rasul Gamzatov heeled into the turn, 670 tons of steel pivoting on the dark water. The AK-630 mount tracked the contact, barrels straining against the limits of traverse, waiting for the bearing to shift those last few degrees. 8 kilometers. The ship was still turning. The bearing was shifting. 271, 272. But the drone was shifting too, its approach angle changing as the geometry evolved. The weapon stayed locked at maximum traverse, hunting the edge of its own cutout while the target drifted along just outside. 7 kilometers. The drone crept to 268 relative. Almost there. The gun crews watched their displays, waiting for the solution to go green, waiting for those last degrees of clearance. 6 kilometers. 265 relative. The bow was coming around. The cutout boundary was rotating with it. The gun could almost... 5 kilometers. The drone slid back to 270. The ship's turn was pushing the contact outward as fast as the maneuver could pull it in. The bearing kept hovering at the edge. 268, 271, 269. The geometry refusing to resolve. The AK-630 tracked the target it could see but couldn't shoot. The superstructure blocking the solution every time the crew thought they had it. 4 kilometers. The captain ordered more speed, trying to tighten the turn, trying to force the geometry. The ship shuddered as the engine spooled up. The bearing crept to 264. The gun mount swung toward the contacts. Green light. The crew had a solution. The operator mashed the trigger. The AK-630 roared, 6 barrels of 5,000 rounds per minute, tracers reaching across the water toward a target that was already somewhere else. The burst lasted 2 seconds, 190 rounds. The drone had shifted to 272 during the engagement sequence, sliding back outside the arc before the rounds arrived. 3 kilometers. The ship was still turning, still chasing, the gun still hunting. The operator fired again, 140 rounds, chewing through the darkness at a bearing that was already stale. 2 kilometers. The geometry had beaten them. The drone had spent the entire approach skating along the edge of the cutout, never quite inside the arc, never giving the gun a clean shot. The crew had done everything right. The captain had maneuvered. The gun had fired. The geometry had won. 1 kilometer. The bridge announced, "All hands brace for shock, port side." The first drone hit the superstructure at 0734. Shape charge punching through steel into the Combat Information Center. Fuel lines rupturing across hot metal. Fire spreading through the forward compartments before anyone could react. 90 seconds later, the second FP2 struck the stern. The ship began heeling through its desperate turn, tracers reaching into empty dark. First impact, fire. Second impact, more fire. And the craziest part was, it had been entirely preventable. The design flaw that sank the Rasul Gamzatov wasn't in her radar or her weapons. It was in the decision to mount a single gun on the bow. Most patrol ships carried 2, one forward, one aft, so at least one weapon could always engage. But the Project 22460 class was built for peacetime Coast Guard work. And someone in St. Petersburg decided years ago that one gun was enough. That decision saved money. It also created a 15-degree blind spot that helped create the Caspian Sea's latest artificial reef. Bye for now.